Okay, so this is the good morning, everyone, and nice to see everyone after the break that this year took, along with many other things. So this is part of a new series called Jewish Thinkers, their lives, times, and thoughts. And the purpose of this series was, first of all, a chance for me to visit thinkers that I've been asked to speak about over time. Many of whom have not been formative in my own philosophy, and therefore sort of I wouldn't naturally focus on, but nonetheless are very interesting and important and significant, and it's interesting to talk about. And I'm open to nominations as to suggestions of other thinkers to speak about. This is not going to go in any particular historical order. In fact, the first thinker we're going to look at is Rav Kook. It's fairly late in the history of Jewish thought. If I would like to look at some of the Rishonim and even the Tanoim in this series. The second general comment I want to make is that the term Jewish thinker was deliberately left vague. What does a Jewish thinker mean? Does it mean a thinker who happens to have been Jewish, or a thinker who is expressing Jewish ideas, or a thinker who has an impact on Jewish ideas, even if they're not Jewish? So there's plenty of important thinkers who happen to be Jewish, but their realm of thought wasn't particularly impactful on the Jewish world, or even engaged in Jewish ideas. They may be a great economist or a great scientist or the like. And then you have thinkers who were Jewish, but had some impact on the Jewish world in interesting ways. So in some respects, Marx, for example, in other respects, Freud. I was asked, Neil's actually not here, but I was asked to speak about Freud and the Jewish approach to some of Freud's ideas. So can he be called a Jewish thinker? He was Jewish and a thinker. And then there's the odd non-Jewish thinker who had significant impact on Jewish ideas, particularly if we look in the past, as we head towards the Greek philosophers. So Aristotle and Plato and the like had a very significant impact on Jewish thought via the Gaonim and many other Rishonim, including, of course, the Rambam. So I do hope to also dip a little bit in some of those. So Jewish thinker is a sufficiently broad title that I thought it sort of allowed space for interesting series. I'm starting on Rav Kook simply because I was asked by quite a number of people to talk about him, and it was pointed out to me that I don't mention him that much when we speak, and that's largely because I haven't learned that much of his writings, and I find him very difficult to understand, and I'll try and explain why also. But he's a very, obviously, doesn't need me to say, very important and impactful Gadol. Not all Jewish thinkers were Gadolim, obviously, he was a Gadol. Originally, the series was titled Great Jewish Thinkers, and I took the word great off because I wanted to look at thinkers who aren't necessarily great Jewish thinkers. He certainly, obviously, is a great Jewish thinker. So that's the figure I wanted to look at. And there's two or three aspects of his lifetimes and thoughts that aren't really appreciated as much as they should be, particularly here in Chutz La'aretz. In Eretz Yisrael, in the Dati Yomi world, he's obviously very, very widely learned. In Chutz La'aretz, we sort of know about him largely as one of the founding fathers of what we call religious Zionism. We've spoken before about religious Zionism and the spectrum of belief, but he had so many other important and interesting things to say. And in some respects, one can also say that he's a father of what we nowadays maybe roughly label modern Orthodoxy or modern Common Orthodoxy, in that he along with Rav Hirsch and along with Rav Soloveitchik, perhaps, were three figures who really addressed modernity on its own terms. So all Jewish thinkers, as modernity approached, began having to address modernity, but some addressed it with resistance to its ideas or extreme skepticism to its ideas. Others invested enormous energy in building up barriers and boundaries to the incursion of modern ideas onto the Jewish realm. And other thinkers engaged with it on its own terms. That doesn't mean they always agreed with everything that modernity had to say, but they engaged. Good morning. They engaged with it on its own terms and believed that it offered insight that had genuine value. And in that sense, Rav Kook, Rav Hirsch, and Rav Soloveitchik are the three perhaps most prominent figures that engaged with it on its own terms. In other words, they listened to modernity, and they felt there were ideas that it had to say that were of importance and relevance to how Yiddishkeit behaved and viewed things. So in that sense, he's one of the founding fathers of whatever label one gives to an attempt to integrate some aspects of modernity into one's life. If we look at Rav Hirsch, but the same really applies to Rav Kook, Rav Hirsch, and Rav Soloveitchik, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean that they were just open to anything that modernity had to say, and they were also involved in boundary building at the same time, obviously, because Judaism and modernity are clearly not synonymous. The concept of engaging with modernity simply means that there's an openness to its ideas and a willingness to explore its ideas on its own terms, and then consider the possibility that that modernity offers insight of genuine worth and value to a Jewish somebody who cares about Jewish practice and Jewish belief and thought. So that's the background to his place in Jewish life. He was a very, very complex figure. We'll see shortly it's important to emphasize, I suppose, when we talk about his life, a number of features. First of all, he's a mystic, and that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to understand his writing. He's not engaging always with the normal tools of rabbinic discourse. So the tools of rabbinic discourse traditionally are quite bound by reason and logic in a very methodological way. So if it's in halacha or lomdus or pilpul, it will involve rules of reasoning which are accessible, and therefore one can engage with them and debate with them. If one is dealing with philosophy, then they'll be engaged in the rules of logic and philosophy. And again, there's the possibility of discourse with those tools. When one's dealing with a mystic, it's harder because the ideas, whilst they have to make sense, are often derived from, or at least expressed as intuition or as insight, without necessarily sort of the methodological building up of in their own right. The Kabbalists will often say that an idea's truth sells itself. It's sort of evidently truthful and impactful and meaningful without needing to sort of argue it in a systematic way. But that's fine. There are ways of dealing with the world in that way, but it makes it very hard for someone who's outside that intuition or who doesn't share it to engage with it. It makes it difficult to have conversation. More than that, mysticism is linked to some degree or other to the idea of an ongoing revelation. And many of the great mystics claimed to have understood that they had insight and revelation. From the Arizal, who learnt things from Eliyahu Novi, to the concept of a magid, some form of angelic communication. And Rav Kook was explicit about a belief in a necessary return to prophetic insight. So Rav Kook's Zionism was not just linked to an openness to a political Zionism with a religious element to it, or even a central religious value in the return of Jews to Eretz Yisrael and to rebuilding their own country. But he believed that with that return would come a shift in our approach to Judaism. He saw a tension in Yiddishkeit, which many other thinkers have had to deal with, between the sublime ideals and values and principles of Judaism and the hard nitty-gritty of halachic practice. And he saw eras of Jewish history in which the sort of pendulum swung one way or another way. So in his view, when Jews were living in Eretz Yisrael at the times of the prophets, at the times of the Nevi'im, there was a very direct spiritual engagement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and there was communication from Hashem. A sort of communication is, in a sense, intuitive. You're hearing it. You're not seeking logic as philosophers might, or lomdus as halachists might, logical reasoning. You're hearing directly from Hashem. You're engaging directly with the spiritual principles. But there's less engagement with the nitty-gritty of detailed halachic analysis of do you need a kli shlishi or kli sheni when you're making a cup of tea on Shabbat. Rav Kook points out that with all the power of the spiritual insights of the Nevi'im, they never really succeeded in making a wholly orthodox world. And we find a refrain throughout Nach of very serious failings in the Jewish world around avodah zarah and mistreatment of the vulnerable and other very serious sort of fundamental ethical failings. And he says it's only when the Chachomim took over who said, okay, enough with these high ideals, but we need to talk tachlis, day to day. We're going to create a system in which every moment of the day is very clearly bound by rules and regimented. That's when you get into the sort of core of real human behavior, which is hands-on, and that's when you can effect real societal change. And he says this is what Chazal meant when they said Chacham Odif Minovi, a wise person. The Chachamim, Chazal, are better than the Nevi'im, the prophets, because they succeeded in bringing the values of Yiddishkeit into lived experience in a way that the Nevi'im didn't. It's a very bold statement. But Rav Kook then said that that can go too far. And it's time for the pendulum to swing back a little bit and for us to sort of refocus on direct spirituality, which perhaps has been lost a little bit. We don't speak that much about raw spirituality. It's perhaps returns a little bit over with the rise of Hasidus and its inroads even into non-Hasidic communities. We were talking about Friday nights before and sort of a spiritual experience of the Kabbala Friday night and so on. But certainly in the much of the East European world, Rav Kook says we've lost contact directly with that direct spirituality. It's time for the things to swing back. And he saw the move back to Eretz Israel as a chance for the beginning of a restoration of stirrings of prophecy. He wrote in a very unusual language for rabbinic leaders. He didn't always write in sort of rabbinic Hebrew. He almost wrote in a neo-Tanakh type Hebrew, a neo-biblical Hebrew, very poetical, very metaphoric. We've spoken before about how different works have different languages, and you need to know the nature of the language. If you read Shakespeare and you think he's giving technical details and you don't understand he's using a metaphor, then you'll misunderstand what he's saying. But if you read a technical book in which it says turn on the microwave and you think it's telling you something about inspiring yourself, then you misunderstand how it works. So Tanakh is poetical, it's metaphoric. The language of the philosophers and halachis, by definition, is in many ways much more technical and specific and detailed and analytical. And Rav Kook is deliberately moving back to a more mystical, holistic language. He's trying to speak directly to the neshama. He's trying to poetry and literature is to try and move you into a certain mindset, a certain frame of mind, a certain way of seeing the world, rather than just direct logical reasoning. Shakespeare and a psychoanalyst may both help you understand human nature, but a psychoanalyst may do it through research papers on neuron activity and the impact of statistical demonstration, the impact on certain forms of therapy. Shakespeare may do that through great literature. He brings you into a certain worldview in which you see a character, like all great art does. You see a character behaving, and that gives you insight into what they are as a person. So Rav Kook is interested in the latter more than the former. He's interested in the art, the creativity, the metaphor, the language, the poetry. He'll use poetry to communicate ideas. He'll use metaphor to communicate ideas because he wants to get you into a certain sort of mindset and a sense of awareness, a state of consciousness that he's trying to promote in order to share his ideas. And indeed, he's explicitly interested in art and music and the like. And this feeds into his interest in modernity because he sees the great artists as giving us some insight into the world. So all I'm trying to say now, and we'll look in future weeks in more detail at all these ideas, is that he's a very difficult thinker to understand. Perhaps all great thinkers are difficult to understand, I suppose. But certainly for someone coming from my Beis Medrash, he's difficult to understand because he's writing in an unusual style, and he's also difficult to understand without being willing to immerse yourself into his world view. So whilst perhaps a philosophical writer or a halachic writer, you can just read an essay or two of theirs and understand that particular idea they're trying to share. When someone is trying to promote ideas through intuition, through quasi prophetic experiences, through poetry, through metaphor, it's much harder just to dip yourself into that world. You can cram for a law exam or a maths exam, perhaps. You can't necessarily cram for English literature because you have to sort of, or art. It can take years of sort of learning to understand it. And something like that is the challenge when reading Rav Kook's writing. And I guess that's all an extended excuse for explaining why I don't quote him that much and why I struggle to understand him. But I was excited in this series about the opportunity to sort of invest a little bit more time into reading him and just trying to share something around him. But I should say, just beware, the result is that what I'm presenting is really a pale reflection of the depth of his ideas. If you really want to understand his ideas, I stress you sort of spend 20 years on it. So that's the sort of general introduction. The other point that I want to make is that we're used to a world in which sort of orthodoxy is divided between sort of clusters around two camps in a sense. Haredi world and the modern Orthodox world, or something of the sort. That's a bit of an illusion. It's more of probably better thought of more of as a spectrum of ideas. And even within what we would call modern Orthodoxy, to what degree is let's say nowadays Soloveitchik or American modern Orthodoxy or English modern Orthodoxy really the same as the Dartinumi world in Eretz Israel, with some of the divisions there and the hilltop settlers and everything around that. I don't want to go into all of that. I'm saying we're used to quite a sort of polarized world in terms of clusters with labels associated with them. What's important finally to understand, and this will be my final general comment before we look at specifics, is the degree to which that didn't exist in the era of Rav Kook. There were other divisions with different labels. I hope in the series on Jewish thinkers, we'll look at the development of Haskalah, but there were other divisions in which there was divides between obviously the non-Orthodox and the Orthodox world, and then you had Maskilim and the like who floated somewhere uneasily in the middle and don't fit neat labels that we use nowadays. Rav Kook is very, very firmly embedded in the core from world. He isn't part of the Haskalah, though some Maskilim like him. He certainly isn't part of the non-Orthodox world. There's some non-Orthodox thinkers like him. He's really part, actually, of the European yeshiva world when he's living in Europe, and then of the old yeshuv when he's living in Eretz Israel. So whilst there's tensions, he's spending a lot of his career rubbing shoulders with Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld, Ish HaLachoma, with the leaders who would go on to form what nowadays we would think of as Meir Sha'arim Jewry, as the Eidah Charedis, as that sort of whole world. He's just part of that minority. He's part of that social scene. That's where he operates. So with those introductions given, let's just run through a brief sort of conversation about his life and upbringing. He's born in 1885 in Russia, near Dvinsk. We will revisit Dvinsk when I hope we have a chance to look at two very interesting figures, the Rogachova and the Meshech Chochmah. Hopefully they'll be on the series. He is part of a large family. There's 8 siblings. There are other Kook family members floating around. The chief rabbi of Rehovot, a very, very distinguished rabbinic line there, are born from one of his brothers, and it's a family that becomes quite a large rabbinic family. He has a father who is a misnagid and a Volozhiner Talmud, the Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, representing the yeshiva world, the Litvish world, the very halachic, Lomdish, halachic discourse world of the yeshivas. And he has a mother who comes from Hasidus, the world of Hasidus. She comes from a Chabad family. And one way of thinking about Rav Kook actually is a lot of his life is spent in a way resolving tensions between these two worlds. Because certainly Hasidus is already opening up. In some ways, you could argue that he's a quasi-Hasidish thinker, also Rav Kook, with his interest in overt mysticism and his sort of views around the ability of mystical insight. His grandfather, his mother's father, had learnt in Volozhin, so quite interesting. So Volozhin is the seat of the teachings of the Vilna Gaon via Reb Chaim Volozhin. Reb Chaim Volozhin has been the chief opponent of Hasidus as represented by the founders of Chabad. And this particular Chabad Chassid, his grandfather, goes and learns in the Volozhin Yeshiva. So he's coming from a swell of very, very interesting influences. And there's definitely some Hasidic impact on his life. He goes through his upbringing in learning in various less well-known yeshivas under various Litvish rabbanim. And at 18, two really important events happen to him. He becomes engaged to the daughter of the Arderes. The Arderes is Rab Elio David Rabinovich Rabinovich Umim. Is double-barrel surname from a very, very famous family in Ashkenazi Jewry, the Umim family. And he's known as Arderes by the initials of his name, Elio David Rabinovich Umim. So he becomes engaged to the daughter of, not married, engaged, there's going to be a long engagement, becomes engaged to the daughter of Arderes. Arderes is going to be very influential on his life, very, very important teacher of halacha and also makubal. And Rav Kook is going to begin learning Kabbala. And the second thing that happens to him at age 18 is that he moves to learn in the Volozhin yeshiva. So those are two important events in his life. Very, very important to understand the Volozhin yeshiva. The Volozhin yeshiva founded decades before Rav Kook joins it by Reb Chaim Volozhiner. It's the first sort of modern, in inverted commas, academic institution of its type. So yeshivas again, we will, I hope over the series, have a chance to look at these thinkers with the detail they deserve. But the Vilna Gaon lays an emphasis on the value of Gemara learning as the and halacha in opposition to Chassidus as the central plank of Jewish learning, as opposed to Chassidus, which it thinks there's importance everyone agrees there's importance, but thinks there's primary importance in engagement with other matters. Reb Chaim Volozhin sets up a yeshiva which is different to other yeshivas. So pre-Reb Chaim Volozhin, most of the yeshivas had simply been rabbonim of cities who had clustered around them a group of talmidim. How many talmidim? Not that many. If it's a small city, maybe they can afford to sustain 3 or 4 students to learn with their Rav. If it's a larger city, maybe they can sustain 15, 20, 25 students to learn with their Rav. When rabbinic contracts were signed and sealed with rabbis of cities, one of the perks of the job that would be offered if it was a big prestigious city that wanted to attract a learned Rav is that we will sustain for you 10 Talmidim, 15 Talmidim, and we'll support them. And that way you'll be able to have teach Torah to the next generation. By and large, these Talmidim, therefore, are not attracted from a wide range of areas. They're just relatively local, unless it's an outstanding figure like Rabbi Akiva Eiger of sorts. Secondly, by and large, the yeshiva is fairly small. Thirdly, its fundraising pool is just that local geographic area. And fourthly, there isn't a divide between Rosh Yeshiva and Rav. So the Rav has to, if they're of a prestigious city, has to be capable of being a Rosh Yeshiva, not just knowing how to paskin and give other sorts of rabbinic care, but able to teach conceptual Torah on the highest level. And the conceptual Torah taught on the highest level is going to be somewhat relevant to practical halacha and to engaged life. You don't have this sort of divide between town and gown that develops in elite academic institutions and nowadays including in the yeshiva world. So if you go to a top yeshiva now, and I'm not making any loaded comments here, this isn't a criticism, it's simply a sociological statement of fact. A lot of the learning is very far removed from halacha and maisa. It's very, very conceptual, but it's not necessarily aiming at creating poskim who can huskan halacha and maisa. And there's a gap between town and gown. The yeshiva bachim are at an age and a stage where they're very idealistic, and nothing wrong with that, very, very idealistic. But there's in a way a distrust of the bourgeois, that you know the bourgeois is seen as a balabatish life is seen as a compromise with ideals. Now it's easy to be skeptical about balabatish life till you're actually out there and you realize how hard it is to earn a living and work long hours and still make it to davening and still be creative and still have a share and still do all of that. But when people are young and in an idealized safe zone of learning, it's easy to have these ideals paralleling sort of in the secular world, students' idealism around theoretically perhaps moralistic models of very socially caring values or the like. But actually, when you get out in the hard world and you realize that means that 70% of your income is taken by the tax man, suddenly your values shift a little bit. So you've got that sort of divide between people out there on the street and those in the academic institution. None of that existed in the yeshiva model, where there were always yeshivas in Klal Yisrael, but pre-yeshiva designs as an explicit academic institution separated off from the town. Reb Chaim Volozhin believes that that model is failing. It's got too much fragmentation. You have too many people clustering around too many rabbanim, not all of whom are actually equipped even to be good Rosh Yeshiva. There isn't the sort of generation of elite students who are talking together, inspiring each other, promoting growth amongst each other, triggering scintillating intellectual thought and so on. And he sees this as a challenge to the from world, because the best and brightest of those who aren't interested in religious thought are going to elite secular academic institutions, and we don't have anything that can match that. We don't have an Oxbridge of the yeshiva world because of this old model. So he creates a new type of yeshiva, which is the Volozhin yeshiva, the mother of all yeshivas, in which you have yeshiva separated off to a degree from the town. It's its own institution. It's attracting not 5 boys or 10 boys or 15 boys, but 200, 250 Talmidim. So it's massive by the standards of the time. And it's explicitly fundraising, therefore, across a much wider catchment area and recruiting across a much wider catchment area. So Chaim Volozhin initially himself, and later through networks of agents, is traveling across Europe, trying to encourage the best and brightest to apply for very selective places in the Volozhin Yeshiva, and also fundraising for it. This has an impact on, you can imagine this creates opposition, because if you're the Rav of a little town and your nachas comes from your 5 or 10 Talmidim who are there by your side, and they're being drawn off to the Volozhin Yeshiva, and your fundraising base is being tapped into now, because suddenly Yeshiva, a town 400 miles from Volozhin, is sending its money to the Volozhin Yeshiva. This is a social revolution, but it happens. The fact is, it happens. Reb Chaim Volozhin is still the Rav of the town and the Rosh Yeshiva. By the time you get to successors, you begin getting this fragmentation between the role of Rosh Yeshiva and the role of Rav, and you have this amazing Volozhin institution. Why am I telling you all of this? Because Rav Kook finds himself at 18 in this incredible institution, which is a hotbed, a ferment of incredible ideas and talk. And we would be making a mistake if we think that the Volozhin Yeshiva is just packed with Masmidim who are learning Gemara full time. It is. It's packed with Masmidim who are learning Gemara full time. And the roast of Volozhin alumni is literally who's who of the Jewish world. It's the factory of all the prominent Gedolim of the next door and the door after that and the generation after that. So it's this incredible institution, but there's so much going on there. There's students taken, again, and that's why I give this background, they're taken away from town life. They're there they're still engaged with the town. There's no dormitories, there's no meals provided. It's not completely cut off, but they're in this bubble in which they're exploring any idea and all ideas, and there's debating and discussion about everything going on in the world. And this is the scene where Rav Kook, the young, I should have given his name, I haven't mentioned this, Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, young Avram Yitzchak HaKohen finds himself. And whilst there's learning going on, phenomenal learning going on, there's underground cells within Volozhin. There's undercurrents of stuff happening, conversations taking place that aren't part of the official curricula. There's people exploring early Zionism, proto-Zionism that's beginning to emerge. There's people exploring socialism that's beginning to be discussed. There's maskilim who are smuggling under the table books of Haskalah and debating those. There are secular books floating around. So there's all this stuff happening, and famously, some of the products of Volozhin are figures like Bialik and others who go on and become important literary figures. There's all this ferment happening. There's also underground Hasidus being learned in Volozhin. It's possible that Chabad even sends undercover agents to Volozhin. In others, it sends Chabad Hasidim in the guise of Bochrim to learn in Volozhin Yeshiva the stronghold of opposition to Hasidus and to spread the Torah of Hasidus. So it's a small yeshiva. It's only, by modern standards, it's 250. I mean, it's a mid-sized yeshiva by modern standards. But when you understand it's this bubbling children of ideas and concepts and debates and thoughts and so on. And this is very, very important in Rav Kook's life, who in many ways sees himself as a Volozhiner for the rest, in some respects sees himself as a Volozhiner for the rest of his life. And this is where he begins meeting some of the ideas at a very, very young age, some of the ideas that really are formative in the rest of his ideas. So he's hearing Hasidus, he's hearing Haskalah, He's hearing Zionism. He's hearing debates about political philosophies, what a nation is. Nationalism is beginning to rise, and Jews are beginning to find themselves caught up in this. Again, I can't remember if I said this. I should have said he's born in 1865. At 18, this is 1883. So just think about your general history. What's going on in 1883? There's socialism and communism and Haskalah and reform and nationalism, and all the big debates are beginning are there in East Europe now. Have hit East Europe in a big way. And he's sort of dealing and thinking about all of these. This is his era in Volozhin. Very impactful on the Netziv, on Rav Kook, very impactful on Rav Kook is his Rebbe the Netziv. The Rebbe Netziv, holy traditional man, holy traditional Rosh Yeshiva, but with interests broader than the typical, what we would think of now as the typical yeshiva curricula. He writes, and we often learn this on our Wednesday night shir, an incredibly beautiful sefer, the Ha'amek Dova, which is a commentary on Chumash, in which the Netziv shows knowledge of philosophy, knowledge of Kabbala, and knowledge of dikduk, of Jewish grammar. Jewish grammar has been neglected really in the traditional Litvish and Hasidic worlds of East Europe for a long time, but the Netziv is interested in Jewish grammar. Jewish grammar is important in the restoration of Hebrew and the like. The Netziv writes exceptionally broadly across the field of rabbinic literature. There's perhaps been no one since the Vilna Gaon who's written as broadly as the Netziv, and the Netziv is to some degree interested in the broader world. Rav Kook himself is a fascinating figure already as a yeshiva bacher. From what we're told, he's clearly not a maskil. He's not engaging with, he's talking to maskilim, interested in Haskalah ideas, but he's definitely not a maskil. He's a completely traditional figure in that sense. He spends periods of his life in which he only speaks in Lashon HaKodesh. Very, very interesting. What's the spoken language at the time? Obviously, it's Yiddish. But he speaks Lashon HaKodesh. He wants to improve his Lashon HaKodesh, and therefore he speaks only Lashon HaKodesh. He also, unusually for Bacha in Volozhin, has a beard. In Volozhin, they're all clean shaven. You may have seen pictures of Bachrim in the Litvish yeshivas where they're all clean shaven. Rav Kook has a beard. Whether this was already the influence of Hasidus or Kabbala, I don't entirely know. I don't know if anyone knows, but he already has a beard at that stage. Okay, so this is the young Rav Kook learning in the yeshiva. At an astoundingly young age. Sorry, so he's 18. I should have mentioned. At 20, he gets married again to the daughter of the Adares. The Adares becomes a rebbe for him, teaches him. The Adares learns Kabbalah with him. This is possibly the first exposure he has to systematic Kabbalah. He's been influenced by Hasidus earlier, so he's met Kabbalah ideas, but this is the first time he has exposure to systematic Kabbalah. And at age 23, he becomes a Rav. I'm not going to go through the next sort of 10 years of his life, but he holds various rabbinic positions. All I will say is a number of highlights of those few years. Well, one is not a highlight; it's the opposite. He loses his wife tragically in an era in which medical care wasn't that good, and he marries his wife's first cousin, who is a niece of Adares. So he keeps a connection with Adares as an impact on his life. He moves into the upper echelons of Kabbalah and begins learning under the Leshem. The Leshem is Reb Shlomo Eliashiv, the most influential Kabbalist of the last 150 years. I can't understate that. He's the grandfather of the more well-known Rav Eliashiv, the posek. Rav Eliashiv is he's the maternal grandfather, not the paternal. Rav Eliashiv's father, as a son-in-law, adopts his father-in-law's surname. Not because of any feminist ideals, but because of army problems in East Europe. So he adopts the surname of his father-in-law, and that's why Rav Eliashiv had his grandfather's surname. The senior Rav Eliashiv, Shlomo Eliashiv, writes a sefer called the Leshem, which is I can't understate how important it is in non-Hasidic Kabbalah. Very, very, very impactful sefer. So he's now He's now influenced by. He's now learning from the premier Kabbalist, really, of at least the Ashkenazi world of his generation. Important events to highlight again in this time are the following. He becomes a writer, quite a prolific writer. He's publishing articles in the rabbinic journals of the time. He is. I'll just give you a taste of some of the things he's writing about. He's writing in the right-wing journals of the Frum journals that are more inclined to Kamos. He's writing more liberal ideas. And in the left-wing journals of left-wing Orthodoxy, which is edging towards Haskalah, he's writing right-wing ideas. I'm no expert on his writing, but to the best of my knowledge, this is a consistent pattern. Almost all his famous pieces in which he's writing more Kanoish ideas, he publishes in left-wing journals. So you see, he's frustrated clearly, but he wants to engender thinking and debate. By the way, in some respects, he's a defender at this stage of the life of the Netziv. The Netziv came under attack from the right for his interest in Dikduk, for some of his comments in his Perush al Torah, and Rav Kook's leaping to the defense of his Rebbe against the Kanoim on the right. So he's interested in provoking thoughts and ideas. He's also writing, but not publishing, what became known as his Pinkasim. Pinkas means bookloads. Notebooks. I don't know if you're aware, by the way, that Rav Kook is an incredibly prolific writer. In his own life, there's many of his works published. Since then, there's just volumes and volumes and volumes of work that's been published, which come from his notebooks. So his whole life, he's writing notebooks and streams of consciousness, incredibly fertile mind that's just bubbling with ideas, and he's writing and can't control this outpouring of enormous heart and enormous minds and creativity and so on. It's unclear what he intended to be published. People go through changes in their life, so whether everything coming out should be published, whether everything he wrote in his private notebooks he would have wanted to be published, whether it all reflects his final views on things, is all unclear. But the fact is, there's a whole industry now in Israel of publishing Rav Kook's Torah, and his famous Pinkasim are still. This is where he begins writing these Pinkasim. And then in 1897, what happens? 1897, the first Congress, the first Zionist Congress, and Rav Kook begins becoming interested in Zionism. Again, to the best of my knowledge, it's the first time he begins seriously thinking about it, and he begins talking about religious Zionism and the needs of religious people to engage with Zionism, and that's when he begins becoming to the fore as a religious Zionist leader. It's important to mention now, so he's now in his late 30s, 1897, no, so I'm 32 only still, so he's only 32. So from 32 through to 40, he begins engaging with religious Zionism. He's not at this stage a particularly important religious Zionist thinker. So if you ask the average East European Jew, who are the senior religious Zionist leaders, he's not one of them at this point in his life, but he's engaging with it. He, by the way, never becomes a institutionally important religious Zionist leader. He never becomes particularly influential in structures of religious Zionism. So, for example, Mizrahi develops as a religious Zionist body, a political party to a degree. It's a political party in East Europe where it runs in elections in various East European elections. So Jews, unfortunately, at the time in interwar Europe, can't, we're not yet up to the First World War, but I'm going ahead a little bit in time. In interwar years, Jews often can't vote for the major political parties. And let's say if you're living in Poland, you will find yourself neither a supporter of the equivalent of Liberal Democrat, Labour, or Conservatives. You can't vote for any of the mainstream parties because they're all anti-Semitic. But the Jewish population is 10% of the country, so you can vote for a Jewish party and expect to get some MPs into the parliament. So Jews set up Jewish parties. Now, of course, they don't set up one Jewish party, they set up 10 Jewish parties or more. I think at the peak, there's 15 Jewish parties, which is a splitting of the Jewish vote, but that's what happens. And amongst those political parties are Agudas Yisrael and Mizrahi, and Bundists and socialists and communists and everything else that you would expect in East Europe, in bubbling East Europe. But he's never particularly influential in Mizrahi as a political party in Poland. He's not particularly influential in Mizrahi as a nascent political party in what's still interwar is Palestine, though we're still pre-First World War. We haven't yet got to the First World War. He's not that influential in what becomes Mizrahi representation in the World Zionist Congresses. He's never particularly influential institutional figure. He never has a particular party base. He never has structural influence. He's a person of ideas and vision, and that's where his influence stems from. Okay, so we're now in his mid-30s. He's married by now to his second wife. He has learned Kabbala from the premier Kabbalist of his era, who people like the Chafetz Chaim hold in awe, in reverence. He's published articles, important articles here and there in rabbinic journals. He has and he's developed an interest in religious Zionism. He hasn't yet, though, published any particular work. He hasn't yet published any particular sefer, though he's beginning to work on his sefer on Agadata. And then the opportunity to move to Palestine, to Eretz Yisrael, emerges, and he's offered the post of Rav of Jaffa. And this is when he begins coming to the fore. So Jaffa is this is
when was it? In which year?
Okay.
In which year was that?
Yeah, I was just asked what year this is. 1940. He's 40. 3940. Yeah.
Oh, he arrived there in 1905.
1905. Okay. So,
I asked whether you know what the Adaris is.
The Adaris is open to it. Is not a kanoi against it, but he definitely doesn't develop his thinking in support of it. So this is in the year. So he's 3940, and he's arrived in Jaffa. Jaffa is a very good stella for Rav Kook in some respects, and also a very challenging post. And I just want to explain a little bit about this. Okay, so what is Jaffa? So the first thing is it's a post. It gives him a panosa in Eretz Yisrael, so that's essential. Without a panosa in Eretz Yisrael, he can't do anything there. It's also an old Yishuv post. Where just again to explain the terminology, Klal Yisrael has always lived in Eretz Yisrael to some degree or other. There's always been Jews that have wanted to live in Eretz Yisrael. There's in particular after the expulsion from Spain in the late 1400s, there's a mass immigration of Spanish refugees to Eretz Yisrael, where they set up post in Sfas, very famously, because there you've got the Arizal and the Beis Yosef from Cairo and everyone else, but they've got in Yerushalayim, and they've got in Gaza, actually, in Gaza at the time, and various other important Sephardi centers of learning. And you have Gedolim back in Eretz Yisrael, people like the Chida and others. Then there's odd Ashkenazim that make it to Eretz Yisrael with great and enormous sacrifice. The Balei Tosfos have in the era of the Balei Tosfos 300, a massive number in a Jewish world that only has tens of thousands of in its total population, moved to Eretz Yisrael. So there's some Ashkenazi presence. The Ashkenazi presence really is boosted when the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov, the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon begin moving to Eretz Yisrael. And along with the Hungarian immigration, produce what we call the Old Yishuv, the Ashkenazi settlers of Eretz Yisrael. They, by and large, find themselves in an Ottoman backwater with very, very little chance of earning a living. They can't engage in agriculture. They can't really own land. They're discriminated against. There's no work. There's no possibility of livelihood. There's no industry. The Ottoman Empire by this point itself is called the sick man of Europe. It's falling apart, and Palestine is a backwater of that. It's really undeveloped, and they basically set up shtetluch, in little ghettos in the old cities of Eretz Yisrael, Tveria, Tzfas, Jaffa, Yerushalayim. And there they engage in low-level work that they can get, in shoemaking and carpentry and blacksmithing a little bit, and learning Torah, but really can only survive through the Chalukah system, through money being sent to them from East and West Europe. So that's the old Yeshuv. And then eventually, of course, what we call the new Yeshuv starts, which is the mass immigration of people who are coming for specifically settler intention, who do begin finding ways to buy land, and they get Rothschild money, and they begin setting up settlements, and you have the beginning of the development of the new Yishuv. So Yaffa is a very good role for Rav Kook because it's an old Yishuv Stella, it's a classic old Yishuv town, but it's out of the center of the old Yishuv, which is Yerushalayim. So he's got space there to develop ideas without coming into head-on clash with the old Yishuv, which has very, very senior rabbinic figures there, like Reb Shmuel Salons and Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin, who are not going to take kindly to his views at all. So that's number one. So Yaffa is a nice sort of compromise position. It's an old-fashioned Stella, old-fashioned position, but it's not it's not right there in the center. It gives him space to be himself. It's also a very good position and a very challenging position because Yaffa, of course, begins developing into a center of the new Yeshuv, into what would eventually become Tel Aviv, Yaffa's twin city, which grows, as we know in this day, into one conurbation where Yaffa is effectively the old city of Tel Aviv. Now, why is this good but also challenging? Because suddenly Rav Kook is forced to confront the realities of real Zionism. And the realities of real Zionism are enormously complicated. And they give him the very tough job of being an idealist who actually has to deal with hard ideas on the ground. Because by now you've probably understood that Rav Kook is a visionary, he's an idealist. He's going to develop into this thinker who's poetic and literary and prophetic and a big ideas person who's worried about too much stress on all he's a halachist, very, very important halachist. He doesn't think Yiddishkeit can just be about focus on the little details. And suddenly he has to deal with hard facts on the ground, which are Yaffa's a port city. So how do Jewish porters earn their job, earn their parnassa when not working on Shabbos is in an Ottoman Empire is a big blow. How do you deal with waves of immigrants who you can't call them secular because they're coming from very traditional East Europe, but quite quickly begin throwing off the mantle of religiosity, who unionize and strike and want to work on Shabbos because that's the only way to carry things out. How to deal with Moshavim springing up, where they begin coming into nascent Tel Aviv for party life, or the beginning of social gatherings. We're not talking about modern day Tel Aviv, but just youths wanting to socialize and do things. So Rav Kook is there in this old Yishuv role, but having to begin dealing with real modern challenges, and he begins a tough part of his career, in which the figures of the old Yishuv get increasingly upset with him for some of his modern ideas, and the members of the new Yishuv get upset with him because of his old-fashioned ideas. So he virulently opposes, we're now, by the way, he's arrived in Yaffa, so again, just the dates were 1904, 1905, he's 40 years old, and he begins getting to know the realities of Eretz Yisrael. He arrives, he begins touring the Moshavim. He says his famous line. He comes to a Moshav and he sees a cow there, and he says a Jewish cow and gives it a kiss. That's the famous story of his arrival in Israel. He can't believe it that Jews are settling this land, and he begins developing a base medrash. He gets some of his important Talmidim, figures we're not going to go into, like Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Chalap and the like, and he begins debating with Zionists. He writes virulently against Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's trying to restore Ivrit. He doesn't have a problem with the restoration of Ivrit, but for anyone who knows Eliezer ben Yehuda's life, he's from the far anti-religious ends of modern Zionism. He's a character who's avowedly anti-religious and then a very strong secularist. He fights against the new secular school in Yaffa, which he's against. On the other hand, he sets up a school called Tachkemeni in Yaffa. There's a few Tachkemenis around East Europe, and he sets up one in Yaffa, which are all schools where you learn Kodesh, but you also learn Chol, and it has science, and it has philosophy, and it has literature on the curricula, and tensions sort of begin building up. I'm going to fast forward just because we're sort of running out of time, and I would like to finish finish the description of his life today. I'll just highlight a couple of other features. In 1913, he's now been nearly 10 years, 8 years in Jaffa. He goes around the settlements of Eretz Yisrael with Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. So they're friends, by the way. They're colleagues and friends with mutual respect, but also quite significant, beginning to emerge quite significant disagreements about their approach to Zionism. And they engage in basically a Kiruv project. So they're going to go around. They're both representatives of the old Yeshuv. Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld more cut off and thinking that the firm approach is going to have to be building higher boundaries, and Rav Kook more willing to be engaged with these moshavim, but they go around on a mission of trying to be mechazik these farmers, many of whom are frum but weak, not particularly learned. That again, I just explain something. A typical new Yeshuv Oleh is not from the far left secular at this stage. Far left secular. They're not anti-religious or avowedly secular. They are, by definition, out-of-the-box individuals because they're willing to give up life in East Europe and move to Eretz Yisrael. They're very often unlearned, and they just simply haven't had the chance to learn yeshiva. The Volozhin, this elite institution, has 250 Talmidim out of a population of many millions. They're not particularly learned. Had they stayed in East Europe, they'd have probably just stayed in the structure of normal from life and just done the normal from thing. But they arrive in Eretz Yisrael, where there isn't the support group and the support structure, and they come under mild pressure to begin letting halacha slip, because there is the secular wing of the Zionism. There's money coming through from the Rothschilds, controlled by some of the Rothschild agents who are anti-religious or skeptical about religious, and just it's a very hard life. They're just and so sort of in a hard farming life, still keep Shabbos and still daven every day just becomes increasingly difficult. So there's a drift for most of them towards secularism, as opposed to sort of any ideological secularism. So Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Rav Kook go around to try and be mechazik them to see what funding is needed, and in each area they create improvements and tikkunim. I had the pleasure and privilege of being in Zichron Yaakov in the summer for a little bit of time, and there's the beautiful Rothschild shul there, Ohel Moshe, Ohel Yaakov, after Baron James de Rothschild, I think. Oh, Yaakov, sorry. So that shul features in the trip of Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Rav Kook. They get there on I don't know exactly the timing, either Thursday or Friday, and they walk into the shul, and they're horrified because the bim is right at the front of the shul. A bim is not meant to be at the front of the shul, a bim is meant to be in the middle of the shul. And the reason, okay, it's a halachic problem, but why is it a big deal halachic problem? The reason it's a big deal halachic problem is because in Europe, this has become a symbol of reform shuls. So in Europe, this has become, halacha is halacha, but which halacha has become particularly important can often depend on sociological things, and therefore this halacha has achieved a sort of prominence more than it should have. And they suspect correctly that this shul is built that way because of some nefarious influence. We know who that influence is. It's the Rothschild agent who's French and wants to modernize things. So yes, they build a shul, but he builds it in the French style with a bimah at the front. So they announce that they're refusing to daven in the shul over Shabbos, and the moshav is gutted because the Gedolei Hador have come to visit their moshav, and they're refusing to daven with them. And on Friday afternoon, they accept the word of all the senior residents of Zichron Yaakov that they're going to change the bimah straight after Shabbos and move it to the middle of the shul, and they agree to daven in the shul over Shabbos. So I just mentioned that as an anecdote because I was there in Zichron, and in my time there, read up the history of it, and it was the bimah is now in the middle. The bimah is there. Sorry, actually, yeah, of course, and the bimah is now in the middle. Okay, I'll just maybe just try and fast forward. The Rav Kook goes to Europe in 1913, and 1913 he goes there for several reasons: fundraising. I think his wife is unwell and needs medical treatment. The war breaks out, and he's now stuck in Europe through the war. Initially, he's in Switzerland. He then moves to London, where he becomes the Rav of the Machzikei Hadas Shul, which now exists in Gold's Green, but at the time was in the East End. And he's the Rav of of that shul. And there's a very famous picture, by the way, of Rav Kook in which he looks very either very East European or very Eretz Yisrael based. I think he's wearing a spodok type fur hat, and behind him is a wall made of Yerushalayim stone, like you sort of see white stone behind him. I believe that picture was taken in London, and it's cold, and he was wearing a fur hat, and I believe the stone behind is from one of the white brick, white. There's these white stone old buildings in the centre of London. I believe that's where the picture actually comes from. He visits museums, and he's interested in the art galleries. I think he spends time in the National Art Gallery and various other things. And then in 1919, so he's now, you can do the maths for me, 55, 54. He returns to Eretz Yisrael, goes to Yerushalayim, and spends the rest of his life there. He dies at age 70. And to cut a long story short there he begins building up Talmidim and has Chabura around him, like a small-scale yeshiva, which eventually develops into what became known as Merkaz Harav, the premier yeshiva institution that built up around him. There, we're still in the interwar years. There he begins really engaging in debate with the old yeshiv, and it gets very nasty and vicious at times. He's still a member of the old yeshiv. His first language is Yiddish. He's dressing like the members of the old yeshiv. He's meeting in social functions, members of the old yeshiv. He's related by family ties with people in the old yeshiv. There isn't a clear separation, but he's still engaged in the old yeshiv. I'll just mention a couple of key features. One very seminal event in his life is there's the elections, Mizrahi elections, and there's considerable debate amongst the frum world. Are women allowed to vote or not? Why is there debate? I'm not going to go into the halachas of this, but very briefly, there's a pasuk, Som tasim alecha melech, that the rulership of the Jewish people is described as a melech. Melech velo malka. Melech is lashon zachar, male, not female. Elections is a rulership. When you vote, everyone is a little king. That's what it means to live in a democracy, that we all cast our vote together to give a leadership. Is a woman allowed to vote or not? This is racking the old yeshuv, because if women can't vote, then the frum world is losing 50% of its votes. By the way, sorry, I should explain why the election's taking place. Who's ruling Britain now? It's no longer Ottoman, it's now British. But there's a representative body that evolves into what we call nowadays the Jewish Agency and other such things, who are the spokespeople for the issue of old and new to the British government and get funding. So based on the British government recognize them as the official representative of the Jewish community, and therefore when it wants to fund Jewish institutions, if it wants to give money to shuls, yeshivas, or a Jewish museum, or whatever it may be, there's a culture camp going on over here. Representation in the Jewish Agency is what becomes the Jewish Agency. The delegate body is very, very important. Can women vote in this election or not? The Mizrahi party is headed by Rav Maimon, who turns to Rav Kook, asking him about women voting, and to their surprise, Rav Kook says, "Chas v'shalom, no way, that's his psak." So I mentioned already, Rav Kook's a complicated character, right? They're not a simple figure. Rav Maimon at that point says, "Leave politics to the politicians, while the rabbis can get on with their rabbinics." And you end up with this. I mentioned he wasn't an institutional figure. Rav Kook loses. Rav Maimon was a Rav, he happened to have smicha. He wasn't a sort of towering scholar like Rav Kook was, and you end up with Mizrahi without a Das Torah, as it were, and that feeds into really developments in Mizrahi to this day. We're aware that Mafdal, as a political party in Israel, fell apart and has fragmented. I don't want to talk about 2024 too much, but as we know, that there isn't really a single Dati Lomi party anymore, and the seeds of a lot of the tensions in the Dati Lomi world about the relationship between politicians and the Rabbonim really is in this episode. So whilst Agudas Yisrael, and which later became Degel and Agudah and so on, went through its own life journey, but has a very, very clear model, for better or for worse, of a Moetzes on top of it, or a rabbinic council that make its big decisions. Mafdal never quite developed that same model, and therefore was never quite as representative of its religious leaders as it should have been. So that's one event that I'll highlight that took place. Issue of women voting. 1929, you have Hebron massacre. Since I'm in the business, I guess, of exploding myths, about the Chevron, about Rav Kook. What I'm saying now, I'll finish with this, is not representative of Rav Kook, but I just want to say this simply to explode some assumptions around Rav Kook. So 1929 massacre happens, and tragically, actually it was a Frum settlement. Many of them got massacred, including the Chevron Yeshiva. Many Yeshiva Bachim got massacred. Rav Ariel, one of Rav Kook's prominent Talmidim, reports Rav Kook as saying that he wonders if this wasn't a punishment for the boys adopting modern dress and shaving. So let me just give you a little bit of background to this, and with this I'll conclude. There's East European yeshivas, Slobodki Yeshiva, who decide to open a branch in Eretz Yisrael. And they open the Slobodki Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, which becomes the Chevron Yeshiva. It moves to Chevron for, in a way, similar reasons to why Rav Kook does well by being in Jaffa, because it can't cope with being in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim, by this point, has become such a center of the old Yeshuv. It's very, very conservative. Nothing moves. They're wearing the old Yerushalmi levush. They're not shaving and so on. Boys come from East Europe, from the Slobodki Yeshiva in East Europe, and they're modern by the standards of the old Yeshuv. And therefore, the Slobodki Yeshiva can't cope in the center of the old Yeshuv. It moves to Chevron. Rav Kook is upset with them. He says, you're being porayed together. The minhag of Frum people in Eretz Yisrael is to wear old Yeshuv clothes, to wear long cloaks and not to shave and to dress in a traditional attire. Who are you to come from East Europe with your modernish lifestyle? And he thinks that Chevron Yeshiva has done wrong to have done this, and he's worried that the Chevron massacre is a consequence of this. An amazing. I just say this to emphasize how different a mindset it is. By the way, this is going completely off topic, and I'd love to look at his life once, the Chazon Ish's life. The Chazon Ish doesn't settle in Yerushalayim when he arrives in the 1930s as one of the young Gedolim. Where does he go to? He goes to Bnei Brak. Bnei Brak, if you like, is the Frum Tel Aviv. It's the new Yeshuv Frum center, because he knows that he'll be stifled in the old Yeshuv in Yerushalayim. Okay, so I just share this as two views of Kook's views around voting and the Chevron massacre. And at age 70, so 1935, Rav Kook passes away. He's nifta. And on that happy note, at 10 o'clock we'll finish. Sorry to end on that note, but in Mitzvah Hashem next week we will begin looking at in more detail at some of the things he said. But I call this series Life and Times, and not because I'm expert on either, particularly not on his life. And I had here sheets of which I was reminding myself of the key dates borrowed from someone. But I think it's important to understand his life in order to be able to understand his thoughts. Sorry, Avram. Yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, someone's just speaking, but yes, he stayed with Avram Kimchi. Yes, when he stayed in St. Gallen. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So a couple of points. So thank you for that. So I skipped so much because I just really wanted to finish his life, as it were, in one session. In Switzerland, in St. Gallen, he stayed with Abraham Kimchi, with Abraham Kimchi, and indeed his one of his thanks is at the front. I have a cousin actually married to another one of his great granddaughters. He has a flourishing family of descendants, and very, very interesting family continuation. But yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so we'll finish there for today, and Emir Hashem on actually next Sunday I'm away. I'm out of town for Chasna, but the week after that we'll go back to philosophy and look at his life. So. Sorry, you wanted to ask something, Mrs. Fax. I've got some Fax.
Yes, I wanted to ask you. The Rabbi Sonnenfeld, Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld,
yes.
How come you went with him around the country? They had such a different way of looking at things. Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld was quite against Rav Kook.
So the question is, what Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld, why did you go around the country with him? Because they shared belief in Yiddishkeit, and they wanted the Moshavim to be influenced in a positive way.
I didn't know that they went together.
I should have perhaps mentioned, just something asked online, when they go around the Moshavim, they have a very different approach. So Rav Kook goes around the Moshavim, he sees these youngsters, and at the same time is being distraught about their lack of religiosity. He's also inspired by their idealism, and he's excited. There's one famous scene in which they're dancing, and he puts on the clothes of a farmer, and he dances with them, and then he gets onto horseback, and he goes galloping round and round with these youths, full of excitement at this. So he sees this bubbling energy of youngsters settling Eretz Yisrael as a positive that needs to be steered back to Bithrum. And Rav Sonnenfeld sees this as something very, very scary that needs to be steered back to Yiddishkeit. So they go on this trip together because they both want to encourage the Moshavim to keep halacha and everything else, but do so in a very different way. So yeah, very positive influence on many of them. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, 100%.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
They became involved in the heads of Achira, didn't he?
Yeah, so that's what I'm going to speak about his ideas. Yeah, and that's where I'll start next time. Yeah.